Revelations from the Fifth Estate on school bus safety are pushing the federal government to act. As we first told you here yesterday morning, the program's digging uncovered 8-year-old research that showed mandatory seatbelts on school buses could prevent injuries and save lives. Let's go to David Cochran, who's going to lead off the hour from Ottawa this morning. What exactly is the federal government doing and saying now, David, in response to what the Fifth learned?
Yeah, Heather, right now the action is really limited to a review. What the federal government says it's going to do, it's going to take a long look at the issue of seatbelts in school buses in the wake of that Fifth Estate investigation. And as you said, that 8-year-old research, a 2010 study by Transport Canada, that found that the padded seats on school buses, they don't prevent injuries in a side impact collision or in a rollover crash. And it also found that seatbelts, if mandatory, could prevent students and kids from being ejected from the school buses during an accident. So what's interesting about all of this is that it contradicts the long-held public position by Transport Canada that seatbelts in school buses do more harm than good. So naturally, an issue like this led to some questions in question period yesterday that came from the NDP. Here's the exchange with Transportation Minister Marc Garneau.
This problem needs to be fixed now. What are the Liberals doing to ensure safety on our school buses?
I have instructed my department to take an in-depth look at the question of seatbelts in buses, a fresh look based on all of the evidence that has been collected since all the way back to 1984, and I look forward to their findings.
So that's the review that Marc Garneau has promised, going all the way back to new data from 1984. He says the department is going to look at safety studies from here in Canada, Heather, but also canvass the globe, look at international studies and see what's been done in other countries on this.
So how long could a review of this size and scope take, David?
Well, that's an open question. I mean, Garneau didn't put any timelines on this when he spoke yesterday, but he did say he wants to make a decision as quickly as possible. Procedurally, this is something I think the minister could order. He wouldn't need to pass legislation, but making the decision is one thing. Implementing the decision would be another thing. Here's what the minister said to reporters.
If we make the decision, for example, that we're going to put additional safety measures in place with respect to school buses, we'll try to do it as quickly as possible, taking into account the fact that in some cases retrofitting or building them into new buses does take a little bit of time.
So there you go. You can see the enormity of the task. It's not just deciding whether this is the right course of action or whether the data on safety warrants it or not. You'd have to retrofit an entire national fleet of school buses and then ensure that new buses coming into the fleet are equipped with the proper either shoulder belt or seat belt, and then figure out how you're going to manage it with like young kids in particular who can't necessarily buckle themselves in. So that is all going to take a huge chunk of time, and it could also take a big chunk of cash if they decide to go down that road, Heather.
Indeed, David. Thank you very much. David Cochran, as we begin things in Ottawa, but picking up on some of those points in more detail. If the government embarks on this kind of a retrofit, Michael Serapio looking into some of the specifics of what it would take to install seatbelts on school buses. Michael.
Well, Heather, you heard Dave say it would take a chunk of cash, and when you're talking about the chunk of cash, it is roughly estimated to be about $10,000. In fact, take a look at some of the graphics we put together for you on this story, because $10,000 would essentially be the cost for each and every bus to retrofit a current bus to have some form of seatbelt. Now, if you look at the two largest school boards in Toronto, the Toronto District School Board and the Catholic Board, well, to retrofit, for example, all the buses they have right now currently in service, it would cost about $18 million, and that's just one city. So it does give you an idea of just how expensive that would be. There's also the question of the cost of essentially creating laws around this, because it would be up to the province to enforce this new regulation if the government were to adopt it, and that's because this falls under provincial jurisdiction. And as well, the seatbelts is not necessarily only retrofitting. The cost could go up, for example, if you require it on every new school bus that's added into the fleet. Dave was talking about that, although that is a longer process. There's also other questions that are involved. For example, for a driver, will there still only be one driver on a bus? Is it up to a single person to make sure that every kid is buckled in not only at the start but also through the journey? Or are you going to have to require a second person to make sure that law is enforced, that the other bus driver can focus on essentially the road. That all said, though, this is not without precedent. That's because the United States, they are actually ahead of Canada on this case. And when I say that, that's because earlier this year, the National Transportation Safety Board in the United States, for the first time ever, made a recommendation that all large school buses should have shoulder straps, not just lap belts, but also shoulder belts to keep kids safe. Now, we have to point out that 4 U.S. states already have shoulder straps. 4 other states require a law that actually have buses with a seat strap, so they would have to upgrade. But in addition to the seatbelt, which is what we're now essentially looking into here in Canada, the United States have gone one step further, Heather. They want all school buses going forward to have collision avoidance systems as well as automatic emergency braking technology. So the U.S. certainly might offer some guidance as we debate this issue.